The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle, as Prince George walked quietly through the rose garden. At 11 years old, he had developed a keen sense of observation that often surprised the adults around him. The young prince noticed everything, from the way the gardeners carefully tended to each bloom to how the security team positioned themselves strategically around the estate. George had always been fascinated by the people who worked tirelessly to keep his family safe. Among them was Captain James Mitchell, a decorated royal guard who had served the family for over 15 years. Mitchell was a tall, stern man with graying temples and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had been assigned as George's personal protection officer 2 years ago, and their relationship had grown into something more than just professional duty. The captain had a unique way of making George feel both protected and independent. Unlike other guards who treated him like fragile porcelain, Mitchell understood that the young prince needed space to grow and learn. He would walk a respectful distance behind during George's outdoor adventures, always vigilant but never intrusive. When George wanted to climb the old oak tree near the lake, Mitchell didn't immediately say no. Instead, he assessed the risks and found ways to make it safe. George appreciated this approach more than Mitchell probably realized. The prince had overheard enough conversations between adults to understand that his life would always be different from other children. He would never experience the simple freedom of walking to a friend's house unaccompanied or riding his bicycle through town without a security detail. But with Captain Mitchell, those limitations felt less like prison walls and more like gentle boundaries. On this particular morning, George was heading to his private tutoring session when he noticed something unusual. Mitchell stood near the main entrance, speaking in hushed tones with the head of security. The conversation appeared tense, with both men glancing occasionally toward the administrative wing of the castle. George's curiosity was piqued, but he knew better than to approach directly. Instead, he slowed his pace and pretended to admire a nearby painting, using the reflection in its glass frame to observe the interaction. What George saw troubled him. Mitchell's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of frustration. The captain's jaw was clenched and his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, a posture George recognized as Mitchell's way of maintaining control when upset. The head of security handed Mitchell what appeared to be an official document, which the captain reviewed with obvious displeasure. As George watched, Mitchell's expression shifted from frustration to something that looked almost like resignation. The captain nodded once sharply, then turned to walk away. But as he did, his eyes met George's reflection in the painting's glass. For a moment, both the guard and the prince froze. Mitchell's stern features softened slightly, and he offered George a small, sad smile before continuing down the corridor. The young prince felt a knot forming in his stomach. Something was wrong, and it involved Captain Mitchell. George had learned to read people's emotions with remarkable accuracy, a skill that would serve him well in his future royal duties. Right now, that skill was telling him that his favorite guard was in some kind of trouble. Throughout his morning lessons, George found it difficult to concentrate. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed his distraction, but attributed it to the beautiful weather outside. She suggested they take their literature discussion to the garden pavilion, hoping the change of scenery might help. George agreed, though his real motivation was the possibility of seeing Mitchell again and perhaps understanding what had happened earlier. As they settled into the pavilion with their books, George spotted Mitchell making his rounds near the perimeter fence. The captain moved with his usual precision, but something was different. His shoulders seemed heavier and he paused longer than usual at each checkpoint. When he thought no one was watching, Mitchell would stare out at the horizon with an expression that George had never seen before, a mixture of sadness and deep contemplation. Mrs. Henderson was reading a passage from a classic novel about loyalty and duty when George interrupted with an unexpected question. "Mrs. Henderson, what happens when someone has to choose between what they're told to do and what they believe is right?" The tutor looked surprised by the mature nature of the question but answered thoughtfully, explaining that such moral dilemmas were among the most challenging aspects of adult life. George listened carefully to her response, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Captain Mitchell and wondering what kind of difficult choice the guard might be facing. The young prince had already decided that whatever was troubling his protector, he wanted to help. George might only be 11 years old, but he was already learning that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the most significant impact. As the morning session ended and Mrs. Henderson gathered her materials, George made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could have anticipated. He would find a way to speak with Captain Mitchell privately, to understand what was happening and offer whatever support a young prince could provide. Little did George know that his innocent desire to help would soon lead to consequences that would change everything for the dedicated guard who had become so much more than just another member of the security team. The opportunity George had been waiting for came sooner than expected. That afternoon, during his scheduled outdoor time, he deliberately wandered toward the section of the garden where Captain Mitchell was conducting a security sweep. The prince carried his sketchbook, a hobby he had recently taken up, giving him a legitimate reason to be in any part of the grounds. Mitchell noticed George's approach and maintained his professional demeanor, though his eyes showed the strain of whatever burden he was carrying. "Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness," he said with his usual respectful nod. "Enjoying the fresh air today?" George pretended to focus on his sketching while studying Mitchell's face. "Captain Mitchell, you seem different today. Are you feeling all right?" The directness of the question caught the guard off guard. Most 11-year-olds wouldn't notice such subtle changes in adult behavior. But George had always been exceptionally perceptive. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much he could share with the young prince. "I'm quite well, thank you for asking, sir. Just some administrative matters requiring attention." His response was diplomatic but not entirely convincing. George set down his pencil and looked directly at the captain. "My father always says that when people we care about are troubled, we should try to help if we can. You've always helped me feel safe and comfortable. Maybe I can help you somehow too." The sincerity in George's voice touched something deep in Mitchell's heart. The captain had spent years maintaining professional distance from the royal family, but this young prince had somehow managed to break through those carefully constructed barriers. Mitchell found himself genuinely moved by George's offer of support. "Your Highness," Mitchell began carefully, "there are times when adults face situations that are complicated. Sometimes we must make choices between different types of loyalty." He paused, looking out at the manicured lawn stretching toward the horizon. "I've been asked to make some changes in how I perform my duties that I'm not entirely comfortable with." George frowned slightly, trying to understand. "What kind of changes? You're the best guard we've ever had. Everyone says so." The innocence of his response highlighted just how much the young prince valued Mitchell's presence in his life. Mitchell smiled sadly. "Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know. But sometimes being the best at something means being willing to stand up for what you believe is right, even when it's difficult." He took a deep breath before continuing. "New security protocols have been implemented that I believe are excessive for someone your age. They would restrict your activities significantly and require constant surveillance that goes beyond reasonable protection." The pieces began falling into place for George. His parents had mentioned increased security measures following some recent global events, but he hadn't realized the extent of the proposed changes. "And you disagree with these new rules?" "I believe," Mitchell said carefully, "that a young person needs room to grow and learn, to make small mistakes and experience age-appropriate independence. Wrapping someone in cotton wool doesn't prepare them for the real world they'll one day need to navigate." His words carried the weight of years of experience and genuine concern for George's development. George felt a surge of gratitude toward the captain. While other adults in his life often treated him like a precious artifact to be protected at all costs, Mitchell understood that he was a human being who needed normal childhood experiences. "So what happens now? Do you have to follow the new rules?" Mitchell's expression grew more serious. "I've been given an ultimatum, Your Highness. Either implement the new protocols exactly as specified or—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the sentence in front of the young prince. "Or what?" George pressed, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Or I'll be reassigned to different duties," Mitchell finished quietly, "away from personal protection services." The impact of these words hit George like a physical blow. Captain Mitchell wasn't just his guard. He had become a mentor, a steady presence who understood George's need for both security and independence. The thought of losing him to bureaucratic inflexibility felt profoundly unfair. George's mind began working quickly, processing the information and considering possible solutions. "Captain, what if there was another way? What if someone higher up understood why the new protocols aren't right for me?" His voice carried a determination that surprised both of them. Mitchell looked at the young prince with newfound respect. "Your Highness, I appreciate your concern, but this decision comes from very high levels of authority. It's not something that can be easily changed." But George was already formulating a plan. His young mind, shaped by years of observing palace politics and adult interactions, was beginning to see possibilities that the adults around him might have missed. "Captain Mitchell, you've taught me that sometimes we have to be brave and speak up for what we believe in. Maybe it's time I learned that lesson." The determination in George's voice both impressed and worried Mitchell. The captain could see that the young prince was prepared to take action, though what form that action might take remained unclear. Mitchell realized that his honest conversation with George had set something in motion that could have far-reaching consequences for both of them. As they walked back toward the castle together, George's mind was racing with possibilities. He had spent his entire life watching how power and influence worked within the royal system. Now, for the first time, he was considering how he might use his own position to protect someone who had always protected him. The young prince was about to discover just how much influence he could wield when he chose to use it wisely. That evening, George sat in his private study, staring at a blank piece of paper on his desk. He had decided to write a letter, but finding the right words felt more challenging than any school assignment he had ever completed. The weight of what he was attempting pressed down on him, yet his resolve remained firm. George understood the delicate nature of palace hierarchy better than most children his age. He had observed countless formal dinners, state meetings, and private family discussions where every word was measured and every gesture calculated. Now he needed to apply those lessons to help Captain Mitchell, but he also knew that one wrong move could make the situation worse for everyone involved. His first instinct was to speak directly with his parents, but George hesitated. While his father and mother loved him deeply, they were also bound by security recommendations from their advisors. The new protocols had likely been approved by his parents based on expert advice, and simply asking them to reconsider might not be enough to change their minds. Instead, George decided on a more strategic approach. He would write to his grandmother, the Queen, who had always encouraged him to think independently and speak his mind when something truly mattered to him. The Queen had often told George that future leaders must learn to balance tradition with innovation, protocol with compassion. George began writing carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone far beyond his years. He started by acknowledging his respect for security concerns and his understanding that keeping him safe was everyone's primary concern. Then he explained his observations about Captain Mitchell's approach to protection and how it had positively impacted his own development. The letter described specific instances where Mitchell had found creative solutions that maintained security while allowing George to experience normal childhood activities. He wrote about the time Mitchell had arranged for him to join a local cricket match by coordinating with the other team's families and conducting thorough background checks without making anyone feel uncomfortable. He mentioned how Mitchell had taught him to assess risks for himself, making him more aware and responsible rather than simply dependent on others. Most importantly, George wrote about the trust and respect that Mitchell had shown him, and how that relationship had helped him grow into someone who could think critically about his own safety, rather than simply accepting restrictions without question. The young prince argued that this approach would better prepare him for his future responsibilities than any amount of additional surveillance could. As George wrote, he realized he was articulating feelings and thoughts that he hadn't fully understood until now. Captain Mitchell hadn't just been protecting his body. He had been nurturing George's spirit and independence. The proposed new protocols would eliminate that crucial balance, turning protection into something that felt more like imprisonment. The next morning, George personally delivered his letter to his grandmother's private secretary, requesting a private audience when Her Majesty's schedule permitted. He knew that such a formal request from someone his age was unusual, but the circumstances demanded exceptional measures. While waiting for a response, George noticed that Captain Mitchell's demeanor continued to deteriorate. The guard maintained his professional standards, but George could see the internal struggle playing out in subtle ways. Mitchell's usually confident stride seemed less assured, and he appeared to be mentally cataloging every interaction, as if trying to memorize moments he might not experience again. 2 days later, George received word that the Queen would see him for tea that afternoon in her private sitting room. As he prepared for the meeting, George felt nervous but determined. This conversation could determine Captain Mitchell's future, and George was acutely aware of the responsibility he had taken upon himself. The Queen greeted George with her characteristic warmth, but her eyes held a knowing look that suggested she understood the gravity of his request for a meeting. "Well, my dear boy," she said as they settled into comfortable chairs overlooking the garden, "your letter was quite thoughtful. You've clearly given this situation considerable consideration." George straightened in his chair, drawing upon every lesson in deportment and communication he had ever received. "Thank you for seeing me, grandmother. I know this is unusual, but I felt it was important to share my perspective on the new security arrangements." The Queen listened carefully as George explained his concerns, occasionally asking questions that helped him clarify his thoughts. She was particularly interested in his observations about how Mitchell's approach had contributed to his personal development and sense of responsibility. "What you're describing," the Queen said thoughtfully, "is the difference between protection that empowers and protection that constrains. It's a distinction that many adults struggle to understand, yet you seem to grasp it intuitively." George felt encouraged by her response. "Captain Mitchell has always made me feel safe while also helping me learn to make good decisions. The new protocols would take away opportunities for me to develop judgment and independence. I understand the need for security, but I also want to grow up to be the kind of leader who understands the real world." The Queen smiled at her grandson's mature reasoning. "And what outcome are you hoping for from our conversation today?" "I hope," George said carefully, "that there might be a way to modify the new protocols to address security concerns while preserving the approaches that have been working well. Captain Mitchell has proven that effective protection doesn't have to mean complete restriction of normal activities." The Queen regarded George with obvious pride. "You've learned an important lesson about leadership, my dear. Sometimes protecting what matters most requires us to take measured risks rather than simply building higher walls." She paused thoughtfully. "Let me see what can be arranged." George left the meeting feeling hopeful but uncertain. He had done everything within his power to advocate for Captain Mitchell and for his own developmental needs. Now he could only wait and hope that his grandmother's influence would be enough to find a solution that worked for everyone involved. The following week brought an unexpected development that caught everyone off guard, including George. Captain Mitchell approached him during his morning walk with an expression that the young prince had never seen before, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and something that looked almost like disbelief. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell began, his voice carrying an unusual tremor, "I understand that you spoke with Her Majesty about our recent conversation." George nodded, suddenly worried that he might have overstepped his bounds despite his good intentions. Mitchell continued, "I want you to know that what you did was both brave and thoughtful. However, I'm afraid it may have created some complications that you didn't anticipate." The captain's words sent a chill through George's heart. Had his attempt to help actually made things worse? "What kind of complications?" George asked, his voice smaller than usual. Mitchell looked around to ensure they were alone before speaking more candidly than he ever had before. "Your grandmother's intervention did result in a review of the new protocols. In fact, a special committee has been formed to reconsider the entire approach to your security arrangements." George felt a surge of hope, but Mitchell's expression remained troubled. "That sounds like good news," George said cautiously. "It would be," Mitchell replied, "except that my superiors are not pleased that I discussed internal security matters with you, even though I tried to be careful about what I shared. They view it as a breach of protocol that undermines the chain of command." The captain's voice carried a heavy sadness that made George's stomach drop. George realized with horror that his attempt to help had inadvertently created evidence that Mitchell had violated security protocols by discussing sensitive matters with a member of the royal family. The very conversation that had motivated George to act was now being used against the captain he had tried to protect. "Captain Mitchell, I'm so sorry," George said, his young voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to get you in trouble. I was just trying to help because you've always been so good to me." Mitchell's stern features softened as he saw the genuine distress on George's face. Your Highness, please don't blame yourself. You acted with the best of intentions, and your loyalty means more to me than you can possibly understand. What's happening now is the result of adult politics and institutional rigidity, not anything you did wrong. But George wasn't convinced. His sharp mind was already piecing together the sequence of events and realizing how his actions had created unintended consequences. The very qualities that made him an effective future leader, his ability to observe, analyze, and take action, had led him into a situation that was more complex than he had understood. "What's going to happen to you?" George asked, dreading the answer. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The review committee is still meeting, but my position here has become untenable. Even if they ultimately decide to modify the protocols as you hoped, my relationship with the Security Administration has been damaged beyond repair." He paused, then added gently, "I've been asked to submit my resignation." The words hit George like a physical blow. Despite his best efforts and his grandmother's intervention, he was losing the one guard who had truly understood how to balance protection with personal development. Worse, Mitchell was losing his career because of a situation that George had set in motion. George felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, but he fought them back. Mitchell had taught him that sometimes being strong meant facing difficult emotions head-on, rather than avoiding them. "When do you have to leave?" "At the end of the week," Mitchell replied quietly. "They're allowing me to finish out my current assignment as a courtesy, but my replacement will take over on Monday." The finality of it overwhelmed George. In just a few days, Captain Mitchell would be gone, and with him would go the sense of security and understanding that had made George's restricted life feel more bearable. The young prince realized that he was learning a painful lesson about the unintended consequences of even well-meaning actions. But even as George grappled with his guilt and sadness, another emotion was beginning to surface: determination. The same qualities that had led him to advocate for Mitchell in the first place were now driving him to find another solution. If his first attempt had created problems, perhaps there was still time for a different approach. "Captain Mitchell," George said, his voice steadying with new resolve, "you've taught me that sometimes we have to be creative to solve difficult problems. Maybe there's still something we can do." Mitchell looked at the young prince with curiosity and concern. "Your Highness, I appreciate your desire to help, but I think it's best if you let this situation resolve itself naturally. You've already done more than enough, and I don't want you to feel responsible for adult decisions." But George was already thinking ahead, his mind working through possibilities that the adults around him might not have considered. The young prince was beginning to understand that sometimes the most effective action required not just good intentions, but also careful timing and a deeper understanding of how institutional power actually worked. As they walked back toward the castle together, George was quietly formulating a new plan. This time, however, he would be more strategic about his approach, taking into account the lessons he had learned from his first attempt to help. Captain Mitchell had taught him to think several moves ahead when assessing risks and opportunities. Now George was about to apply that lesson in a way that would surprise everyone, including himself. The young prince was discovering that real leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility, not just for the outcomes you intended, but also for the unintended consequences of your actions. More importantly, he was learning that true leadership meant never giving up when something important was at stake, even if the first attempt didn't go as planned. George spent the next 2 days in careful observation and planning. He watched how different members of the palace staff interacted with each other, paying particular attention to the informal networks of communication that existed alongside the official hierarchy. His plan was taking shape, but it required precise timing and a level of diplomatic skill that he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. The young prince had realized that his first approach, while well-intentioned, had been too direct and had inadvertently highlighted the very behavior that had gotten Mitchell in trouble. This time he needed to find a way to demonstrate Mitchell's value without drawing attention to their personal conversations about security protocols. George's opportunity came during the weekly security briefing that his father attended. While he wasn't normally included in these meetings, George had noticed that they always took place in the conference room adjacent to the library where he often studied. The walls were thick, but the ventilation system carried voices between the rooms, allowing George to overhear fragments of conversation. On Wednesday afternoon, George positioned himself in the library with his homework, knowing that the security meeting was about to begin. Through the shared ventilation, he could hear the voices of his father, the head of security, and several other officials discussing various aspects of palace protection protocols. The conversation eventually turned to Mitchell's situation and the search for his replacement. George listened as several candidates were discussed, their qualifications and experience levels analyzed in detail. What became clear was that none of the potential replacements had the combination of experience and adaptability that Mitchell possessed. One official mentioned that the new protocols they were implementing would require guards who could follow instructions precisely without questioning procedures or suggesting modifications. George understood immediately that this was exactly the opposite of what made Mitchell so effective, his ability to think creatively while maintaining security standards. As the meeting progressed, George heard his father express some concerns about the timing of Mitchell's departure. "Are we certain that this change is necessary right now?" his father asked. "The current arrangements have been working well, and stability is important for George's sense of security." This was the opening George had been hoping for. His father was already questioning the decision, but needed additional information to justify reconsidering it. George realized that he could provide that information, but not through another direct appeal. Instead, he needed to create a situation where Mitchell's unique value would become obvious to everyone involved. That evening, George approached Mrs. Henderson, his tutor, with an unusual request. "Mrs. Henderson, I've been thinking about my upcoming birthday celebration. Instead of the usual formal party, I'd like to do something that involves the community. Maybe visit the local school or organize an outdoor event where I can meet young people my age." Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. Royal birthday celebrations were typically carefully orchestrated affairs with limited spontaneity. "That's a lovely idea, Your Highness, but such events require extensive security planning and coordination with local authorities. It would need to be approved through proper channels." "I understand," George replied. "Could you help me write a formal proposal that outlines what I'd like to do? I want to show that I can think responsibly about security concerns while still engaging with the community." Mrs. Henderson agreed to help, intrigued by George's initiative and maturity. Together, they crafted a detailed proposal for a community birthday celebration that would demonstrate George's growing sense of social responsibility, while requiring sophisticated security coordination. The proposal made its way through official channels and eventually landed on the desk of the head of security. As George had anticipated, the complexity of the proposed event would require the kind of creative security planning that was Mitchell's specialty. The timing was perfect. With Mitchell scheduled to leave at the end of the week, his replacement would inherit this challenging assignment. 2 days later, George overheard another fragment of conversation that confirmed his strategy was working. The head of security was discussing the birthday event with his father, expressing concerns about their ability to manage such a complex operation without Mitchell's expertise. The new protocols they had been implementing were designed for routine protection, not for the kind of adaptive security planning that community events required. "Perhaps," his father suggested, "we should reconsider the timing of Captain Mitchell's departure. This event would benefit from his experience, and it might give us time to ensure a smoother transition to new personnel." George felt a surge of hope, but he knew the situation was still delicate. Mitchell's expertise was becoming obvious, but the institutional pressure to follow through on his resignation remained strong. The young prince realized that one more carefully calculated move might be necessary to tip the balance in Mitchell's favor. That afternoon, George made what appeared to be a casual comment to his father during their regular walk. "Father, I've been thinking about my birthday celebration proposal. I hope whoever handles the security planning understands that I want the event to feel natural and welcoming, not like a military operation." Captain Mitchell always seemed to understand how to make security feel protective rather than intimidating. His father looked thoughtful. "You're quite observant, George. That balance you're describing is indeed difficult to achieve. It requires experience and good judgment." George could see that his father was processing the implications of this observation. The seed was planted. Now George could only wait and hope that the adults around him would reached the logical conclusion that removing Mitchell at this critical moment would compromise both the success of the birthday event and George's long-term security needs. The young prince was learning that sometimes the most effective influence was exercised not through direct demands, but through creating situations where the right decision became obvious to everyone involved. Friday morning arrived with an atmosphere of uncertainty that permeated the entire castle. George woke early, knowing that this was supposed to be Captain Mitchell's last day, yet hoping that his careful maneuvering over the past few days had created enough doubt to change the outcome. The young prince felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever before. As George made his way to breakfast, he encountered Mitchell in the main corridor. The captain's expression was unreadable, but there was something different about his bearing. Less of the resigned sadness that had characterized his demeanor all week, and more of his usual alertness and purpose. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Mitchell said with his customary professionalism. "I trust you slept well?" "Good morning, Captain," George replied, searching Mitchell's face for clues about what might have transpired overnight. "You seem different today. Has something changed?" Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Your Royal Highness, I've learned over the years that things are rarely as final as they first appear. Sometimes circumstances can shift in unexpected ways." His words were careful, but George detected a note of cautious optimism that hadn't been there before. Before George could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared with an urgent message. "Your Royal Highness, your father would like to see you in his study at your earliest convenience. He mentioned that it concerns your birthday celebration proposal." George's heart began racing. This was either very good news or very bad news, and he couldn't determine which from Mrs. Henderson's neutral expression. He thanked her and headed immediately toward his father's study, with Mitchell falling into step beside him as protocol required. When they reached the study, George's father looked up from a collection of documents spread across his desk. His expression was thoughtful rather than stern, which George took as an encouraging sign. "George, please sit down. Captain Mitchell, please join us as well." The fact that Mitchell had been invited to participate in the conversation was significant. If his resignation was truly final, he wouldn't be included in discussions about future security arrangements. George felt a flutter of hope but tried to keep his expression neutral. "George," his father began, "your proposal for a community birthday celebration has sparked considerable discussion among the security team. It's an ambitious project that would require careful coordination and sophisticated planning." He paused, looking between George and Mitchell. "The consensus is that such an event would benefit from the expertise of someone who understands both security requirements and your personal preferences." George's father continued, "Additionally, the review committee examining our security protocols has concluded that our current arrangements have been more effective than initially assessed. They've recommended maintaining proven approaches while implementing only selective modifications rather than comprehensive changes." The meaning was becoming clear, but George waited for his father to spell out the implications explicitly. Mitchell remained perfectly still, his training allowing him to maintain composure even in moments of significant personal consequence. "Captain Mitchell," George's father said, turning his attention to the guard, "I understand you submitted a resignation letter earlier this week. I'm hoping you might consider withdrawing that resignation and continuing in your current position, with perhaps some additional responsibilities related to special events coordination." The relief on Mitchell's face was barely perceptible, but George caught it. The captain maintained his professional demeanor as he responded, "Sir, I would be honored to continue, serving in whatever capacity is deemed most beneficial to the family and the security of His Royal Highness." George felt a surge of joy but worked to keep his reaction appropriate to the formal setting. His father wasn't finished, however. "George, I want you to understand something important. While your initiative in proposing the community celebration was commendable, I suspect there may have been additional factors that influenced your timing and approach." George's stomach tightened. Had his father discovered the extent of his behind-the-scenes maneuvering? "What do you mean, father?" His father's expression was knowing but not disapproving. "Leaders often need to find creative ways to achieve outcomes they believe are important. However, they also need to understand that transparency and direct communication are usually more effective than elaborate strategizing." He paused. "In the future, if you have concerns about personnel or policy decisions, I hope you'll feel comfortable discussing them directly with me." George realized that his father had understood exactly what he had been doing, but rather than being angry, he seemed impressed by the sophistication of the approach while also providing gentle guidance about more straightforward methods. "Yes, father. I'll remember that." "Good," his father said with a slight smile. "Now, Captain Mitchell, since you'll be staying on, I believe you have a birthday celebration to plan. George has some specific ideas about community engagement that I think you'll find both challenging and rewarding to implement." As they left the study together, Mitchell walked beside George in comfortable silence until they were out of earshot of others. Then he spoke quietly. "Your Royal Highness, what you accomplished this week was remarkable. You identified a problem, developed a strategy, and executed it with patience and skill. Those are the qualities of an exceptional leader." George felt proud but also thoughtful. "Captain Mitchell, I learned something important too. Sometimes helping people requires understanding not just what they need, but also how systems work and how to influence outcomes without creating additional problems." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "That's a lesson that will serve you well throughout your life, sir. The ability to effect positive change while working within existing structures is one of the most valuable skills a leader can possess." As they continued their walk through the castle grounds, George felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had not only kept Mitchell from leaving, but had also learned valuable lessons about leadership, strategy, and the importance of persistence when working toward goals that mattered. The young prince was beginning to understand that real power lay not in simply making demands, but in creating situations where the right outcomes became inevitable. 3 weeks later, George's community birthday celebration took place on a brilliant Saturday morning in the village square near Windsor Castle. The event had become everything George had envisioned and more, thanks to Mitchell's meticulous planning and innovative security arrangements. Local children, their families, and community leaders mingled freely with George in an atmosphere that felt genuinely festive. Rather than artificially formal, Mitchell had orchestrated the security with his characteristic blend of thoroughness and invisibility. Plainclothes officers blended seamlessly with the crowd, while the visible security presence was friendly and approachable rather than intimidating. Parents felt comfortable allowing their children to interact naturally with George, and the young prince was able to experience something close to a normal birthday party for the first time in his life. As George played cricket with a group of local children, he caught sight of Mitchell positioned at the edge of the field. The captain's eyes constantly scanned the crowd, but his posture was relaxed and confident. More importantly, George could see genuine satisfaction on Mitchell's face as he watched the event unfold exactly as planned. The success of the celebration had not gone unnoticed by the palace administration. Several senior officials had attended as observers, and George overheard numerous conversations praising Mitchell's innovative approach to event security. The captain had demonstrated conclusively that effective protection could coexist with meaningful community engagement when handled by someone with the right combination of experience, creativity, and judgment. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, George's grandmother approached him with a knowing smile. "Well done, my dear boy," she said quietly. "Your birthday celebration is lovely, but I suspect you're even more pleased about Captain Mitchell's continued presence on your security team." George looked at his grandmother with surprise. "Did Father tell you about what happened?" The Queen chuckled softly. "George, I've been navigating palace politics for many decades. When an 11-year-old successfully influences institutional decisions through strategic planning, rather than emotional appeals, word tends to reach my ears." Her eyes twinkled with amusement and pride. "Your approach was quite sophisticated, though I hope you'll remember that sometimes the direct path is equally effective and less complicated." George nodded thoughtfully. "I learned that lesson too, grandmother. But I also learned that sometimes adults get stuck in patterns that prevent them from seeing good solutions. Captain Mitchell was being punished for exactly the qualities that make him excellent at his job. And what do you think that teaches us about leadership?" the Queen asked, genuinely curious about her grandson's perspective. George considered the question carefully before responding. "I think it means that good leaders need to pay attention not just to rules and procedures, but also to the actual results those rules produce. Captain Mitchell's approach works better than the standard protocols because he understands that protecting Me means helping me grow into someone who can handle real-world challenges. The Queen's expression showed obvious approval. That's a very mature insight, George. The ability to distinguish between following rules and achieving objectives is indeed crucial for effective leadership. As the celebration continued into the evening, George reflected on everything that had happened over the past month. He had started with a simple desire to help someone who had been kind to him, but the experience had taught him far more about leadership, influence, and institutional change than any formal lesson could have provided. Mitchell approached as the event was winding down, his professional demeanor softened by obvious satisfaction with how the day had unfolded. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. This celebration has been a tremendous success, and I suspect it's established a new model for how we can balance security requirements with meaningful public engagement." George smiled up at the captain, who had become so much more than just a guard. "Captain Mitchell, you taught me that sometimes we have to be brave and stand up for what we believe in." "I was just applying that lesson." Mitchell's expression grew serious for a moment. "What you did required not just bravery, sir, but also wisdom and patience. You could have simply demanded that I stay, but instead you created circumstances that made my value obvious to everyone involved. That shows a level of strategic thinking that will serve you well in all your future endeavors." As the last guest departed and the cleanup began, George felt a deep sense of contentment. Captain Mitchell would continue as his primary protection officer, but more importantly, their relationship had evolved into something that transcended the typical boundaries between royalty and staff. Mitchell had become a mentor who understood that true protection meant preparing George for the challenges he would face as a future leader. The young prince had learned that effective leadership often required working within existing systems rather than simply rejecting them. He had discovered that influence could be exercised through patience and strategy rather than authority and demands. Most importantly, he had realized that the best outcomes often resulted from understanding other people's perspectives and finding solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate concerns. As George walked back toward the castle with Mitchell beside him, he felt more confident about his future than ever before. The events of the past month had shown him that he possessed not just the position to influence outcomes, but also the intelligence and character to use that influence responsibly. Captain Mitchell's continued presence would ensure that George continued to learn the delicate balance between security and independence that would be essential for his role as a future leader. The subtle yet strong decision that had begun with a young prince's concern for a valued guard had ultimately strengthened both George's understanding of leadership and the palace's approach to balancing security with personal development. It was a lesson that would serve George well throughout his life, and a victory that had been achieved not through confrontation or emotional appeals, but through careful observation, strategic thinking, and patient execution of a well-conceived plan.